Welcome everyone to Celestial's webinar, Building Enterprise Applications with React and Utilizing Our Best Practices from Lattice.js. We're going to give just a few seconds because we're seeing other people log in, so just hold on. And we're just going to wait just a few more seconds here as other people log in, but we will be recording this as well. Okay, I think we're ready to go. I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Phil Mirola. I am the Director of Business Development for Celestial Systems. And I wanted to just give a quick overview of Celestial for some of those who may not be familiar with the company. Celestial is a high-end enterprise application development company specializing in the web and mobile domains. We possess complete end-to-end capability to take an idea from inception all the way through to deployment. We come from a strong lineage of front-end JavaScript frameworks and have been working and investing in React since inception. Currently, our customers range from small to medium companies to large Fortune 100 enterprises. As part of our commitment to React, we have created our in-house best practices examples called Lattice.js. Mark Usmano will be discussing those briefly during the webinar as well, which leads me to introduce everyone to Mark, our in-house front-end expert. Mark Usmano will be walking through our overall beliefs on enterprise app development using the React ecosystem. Along the way, he will point out the advantages of React as well as some areas of difficulty that tend to arise. We have been fortunate to work with React in a wide array of verticals, and we hope to share some of that experience with you today. Now, we welcome any questions you may have. Simply put them in the chat box, and we will do our best to answer those questions at the end of Mark's presentation. Thank you for that. Now, I'm going to hand this over to Mark and let Mark introduce himself, and we'll start it off. Thanks, Mark.
All right. Thank you, Phil, and welcome everyone to our inaugural webinar. Just a little bit of background on myself. Again, Mark Guzmano. I've actually been doing web-based development for quite a while. I'm a former Sencha architect and product evangelist, Sencha being another web development platform, the Ext.js product in particular. I also spent a lot of time building using React and the components of Sencha. So I'm very well versed in React and now do most of my work from an architecture point of view, helping customers figure out how to use React, how to build enterprise applications. And I'm really delighted to be able to share some of that with you during the webinar here. Again, we look forward to hearing from you. And if Phil hadn't mentioned it, we will take some questions at the end of the webinar. We'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So as you're thinking of those, feel free to type those into the chat window so that we can see what we might be answering. So let's go ahead and get started. So the idea here is you want to build an enterprise React application, and you really don't know where to start. We'll talk a little bit about what you get from React from a starting point. There's plenty more that you need than what Create React app gives you, which is the typical CLI that people use to create an application. Beyond that, there's a lot of tools and techniques and components that really build into your toolbox for building enterprise applications. So what we're going to talk about in this webinar is an approach to kickstarting your development, to getting those tools and technologies into your application much quicker than you having to do all the individual research yourself. So I guess the first thing we should do is talk about this concept of an enterprise web application. What makes that so special? And I thought the best way to do this is to talk about what you get with React itself. And those of you who've done React development are familiar with the tool called Create React App. And that tool produces a starter React application. So I thought I'd start with that, and I've created a starter React application. I didn't want to wait for the whole thing to build, so right before we started the session, I went ahead and I typed npx create React app React starter. npx might be something that you're not familiar with. npx just goes out to the npm repository and gets the latest version of whatever I'm running. So I'm running create React app. So I'm going to get the latest version of React, the latest version of create React app, which is version 17 of React. And I just create a very simple application called React Starter. That application is generated. You can see there's quite a bit that gets generated. And at the end of the application, I have a folder called React Starter. And what I've done is just brought up a very simple, an example of my application in the code editor that I tend to use, which is Visual Studio Code. So you can see here that I get the starter of a React application. I get a webpack.json. I get the structure for building an application. The thing to notice, though, is you don't get much beyond React. You get React itself. You get React DOM, which manipulates the DOM environment. But the starter app that you get is very, very generic. It's just a couple of divs, a little spinning logo for React. So I thought I'd go ahead and just run that to say, just to give us a starter point for building applications. So I just typed npm start. It's going to start the React environment. And here I am at my starter application. The spinning logo, a little bit of text, a link to learn React. But I don't get anything more than that. I don't get what I need to build an enterprise application. So what I want to talk about is what it actually means to build an enterprise application beyond this create React app. So I started listing out some of the things that you typically need in an enterprise application. And this by no means is an exhaustive list, but it is a good list for us to start thinking about what those needs would be. First off, an enterprise application should take advantage of the latest React capabilities. I think version 17 of React came out within the last couple of weeks. Version 16 had a lot of great capabilities for React hooks, state management. There's a lot of performance improvements in that version. All of those things should be a part of your toolkit. It should be that you're using the latest, greatest capabilities of the React library to begin with. There's also a lot of capabilities that you want that deal with user interface design and the user experience. What that amounts to for a lot of people ultimately is theming and styling. So the React world, as we'll see, really brings together components from a lot of different areas. React does not have a set of robust enterprise level components in the library. So having those components used together in an application, looking the same, being styled the same, is really more of a challenge than you would think. So that's another thing we want to think about from an enterprise application point of view. Another big capability or another design user experience concept that's gaining a lot of traction is the idea of a dashboard. And a dashboard tends to be a lot of analytical data, a lot of very rich components, things like graphs and robust charting and lists of data. And all of those things have to feel like they're part of the same application and have to give an experience that an enterprise application ought to give to the user. Security and authentication are definitely part of an enterprise application. I want to make sure my application is secure, only being used by the users that I intend it to be used for. I want to make sure that if a user is no longer part of my organization, that they are not able to get to the application. So that whole category is huge for enterprise applications. Data and data analytics, the focus on building applications that present data. Yes, those applications may present just typical grid-oriented data, but you probably will have richer forms of data presentation, things like charts or maps, or even very complex data visualizations. So those tend to be parts of a typical enterprise application that, again, don't come with React. And then last on this list, but certainly not least, is the ability to access data from a remote server, either in the form of RESTful APIs or in more popular and more modern ways, like something called GraphQL. So as I said, this is not a complete list of the types of things that you want in your enterprise application, but it certainly is a good start. And the question is, how do I get all these things? Or how do I go from that very simple Create React app to all these enterprise capabilities if I'm starting just from what was produced with Create React app? Well, at Celestial, the answer to that is something called Lattice.js or Lattice.js, or just simply Lattice. The idea with Lattice is that it's an open source set of best practices, examples, best practices libraries, essentially building on top of your starter application to allow you to build your enterprise application the right way with known best practices components to handle the issues like security that I mentioned on the previous slide. And Lattice from Celestial is meant to become your ever-evolving best practices site that you can use to formulate the architecture of your React application. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about it and show you some examples, because really you want to take that next step right away to start building those enterprise applications that you're here for. So I've talked about Lattice being a set of best practices. You also want to be it to be familiar. A lot of you, I would imagine, do use what I showed initially, Create React App. And a lot of you are doing your data bundling with what's built into Create React App, or you've exposed the Webpack bundling environment. And these are very familiar tools in the ecosystem that you want to be able to use as you start building enterprise applications. And you really want to get started quickly with components, and you want those decisions to be solid decisions. Typically, you'll have some sort of a data presentation in the form of a grid. And so in that case, we showcase several grids currently, AG Grid and the Sencha Grid, and that will evolve as we feel others should be in best practices. Charting, another major area. Graphs, bar charts, pie charts, those kind of things are very important to an enterprise application. In the case of Lattice, we showcase fusion charts and recharts. State management is huge in an enterprise React application. So in the case of Lattice, we have examples in React Redux, MobX, and most recently with the latest versions of React, the context API and use reducer is becoming more and more popular. So we're bringing that into the fold as well. And then from a data access point of view, I mentioned two very popular data access techniques, REST, for which Axios is a very popular library that we recommend and have as a best practice. And then Apollo is the client front end to do GraphQL. So at a high level, that's the capabilities that are in Lattice. But enough talking about it, let's take a look at it. So I'm going to go ahead and click into the Lattice.js website. And this is an introductory site that gets you introductory information on what Lattice is. There's documentation on the best practices boilerplate applications that I'm going to go a bit into. There are some videos to get you started with Lattice. So there's a lot of good information. The heart of Lattice, though, if I scroll down here, is the GitHub repository. So again, Lattice is an open source environment that presents best practices, examples of starter applications that take you beyond the typical Create React app. And so I'm going to talk a bit about these to get you started on development with those. There are also examples of components that are best practice components in the React ecosystem. So under the packages folder, you'll see that. So we're going to explore a little bit more here by looking at some of these examples, and all of these contribute to the building of a React Enterprise application. So let me just start out with a couple of the examples that are in here. I'm going to start out with the basic one. As you'll see in a moment, it's called basic for a reason. It is very basic. And we really give you two different ways that you can create an application in the Lattice environment. Early on, we started out building our own command line interface to generate applications. And we called that interface CLAP, which allowed you to very quickly create an example, in this particular case, the basic example of the Lattice suite. Most recently, though, Create React App added the capability of building templates. So now we can offer you, in a very familiar environment, those of you using Create React App, the ability to create applications that go beyond the basics of Create React App, because we've added a template property, and that template property will allow you to build against all of the different templates that we have available. So if I wanted to create a new application and base it on the basic application in Lattice, I merely would use Create React App, give it a name, and then specify the template that is used. You may want to know what the templates are, and I'll show you that in a minute here. But I want to just give you an idea of what a couple of these templates look like. So this is actually a screenshot of the basic template. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to bring over my cloned instance of Lattice. So I went to the Lattice website, did a git clone to bring that instance down locally. And I'm in the examples folder. And you'll notice here that the examples folder contains, among other things, a basic example. So if in Visual Studio Code, I right-click and select the terminal, now I'm in that folder for the basic example. This basic example is a typical Create React App application. You'll notice that it has a couple of scripts in here that uses React scripts, but unlike the base Create React App starter, we have a few more dependencies here. And some of the dependencies are Lattice dependencies, and some of the dependencies are external packages that we feel give you the best starting point to building an application. In this particular case, a package that's called Material UI. So let me go ahead and just run this. npm start gets us started. I've previously done an npm install in this folder, and that's why I have the node modules. But let me go ahead and just do npm start. You at least get some visualization of what a template looks like here. We'll go ahead and say yes to get this started. And now what's going to happen is this is going to pull up the basic example in a browser, subject to the server that Create React App provides. And we get the starting point for an application. Again, there's not much to it. It is the basic example, but it does start giving us some capabilities that we don't have if we just start with a Create React App application. First off, we've got some simple components in here that begin to build upon the concept of a dashboard. We also have components that allow us to do theming and to do consistent theming. So you'll notice here that this button here is turning on night mode, and all of the components react to that clicking. So a little bit of theming, but it's not much here. But the idea here is that the basic example is for those of you who want a good, solid base to build your application, but want to build upon that base with either components that you bring in individually or components that you may have built. So we wanted to have a starter that reflected that. A more robust example that I think is going to be more attuned to maybe where you'll start is the one that we call rechart, grid, and map. And it's an appropriately named example because it showcases charting with recharts, a grid with AG grid, one of the more popular grid components in the React ecosystem, and mapping capabilities. So rechart, grid, and map is another example, even a better example, I think, that showcases how you can start with these Lattice examples. So here's rechart, grid, and map. I'm going to go ahead and open that up in the terminal. To save time, I've also done an npm install so that I get the node modules folder. And then this time, if I do an npm start, we're going to get a little bit more robust starter application. And I'll spend a little bit of time with this application just so you see it. So we're going ahead and get started. It's reusing port 3001 that we used for the basic example. I stopped that example, so we shouldn't see an overlap here. And once the build is done, so it's building in the background here. Once that build is done, we'll have the starter for rechart, grid, and map up and running. This starter is really a good starter if you're going to build, for example, an analytics-based dashboard application, because it really brings in some of the major capabilities in terms of components that you tend to see in these robust dashboard applications, things like charting. So in this particular case, it showcases the same theming capabilities. So if I click over here on the theme, I get a dark mode, I get a light mode. The key here to see is that the component itself is taking advantage of the theme in a consistent way across the application. We'll see that when we go over to AG Grid and to the map itself. You'll also see a menu component here that allows me to get started with menuing. In this particular case, we're taking advantage of the library called recharts, which is one of the more popular open source charting solutions in the React ecosystem. We have a parallel example of this that uses a commercial product called Fusion Charts that gives you that ability if in your decision process you would rather have a commercially supported product for charting available in your application. As I mentioned in this example, the grid that we chose to display is the AG Grid product. It is a commercial product. They have a community edition of it, but we have found that very rarely do enterprise applications get built without the need for a grid in some form or fashion. So we wanted to showcase the introduction of a grid into the environment. And again, just like with the chart, I want to be able to integrate the look and feel or the theming capabilities of that chart within the application itself. This may not seem to be that difficult on the surface, but as you start building your collection of components for your enterprise React application, you'll find that theming is wildly different compared depending on which component you choose. And bringing together a consistent theme is a bit of a challenge. And this is one of the reasons that we packaged some components into the Lattice umbrellas to make that easy for you and something that you don't have to think about. And then finally, this also includes a map or the ability to visualize data in some form or fashion. This could either be standard mapping software, it could be some visualization software like D3, which is one of our recommended best practices packages. Or in some cases, if you really get very sophisticated in your dashboards, you may need 3D capabilities. And there are libraries, in particular, the 3.js library that we recommend that really help you start building some of that 3D capability into the application. So let's take a look a little bit at this application just to understand how it's structured and maybe how it's different from the Create React application that we saw a moment ago. And to do that, let me just come back to this Create React application again. This was the first application I started. Here's the index.js of that application. You'll notice very straightforward, very bare bones. We do a React DOM.render just of the root component called the app component. And then that app component doesn't do much at all, if you recall. Just sends out a couple of divs and a header. So pretty straightforward. Let's contrast that a bit to what you might typically find in a React Enterprise application. And I think this rechart grid map application is a good example of that. So let's get to the same point. Let's get to the index.js of an enterprise application. The first thing you may notice is that unlike the simple application that just starts the main component, there is an intermediary component that's going to do something before we start the main component. Because a React application that's simple probably is just one view, probably doesn't have a menuing structure, probably doesn't need to deal with security. There's a lot of things that you want to deal with, and those things tend to be at a global level. So the structure of this application accommodates that. So let's look at what main.js does and contrast it to what we saw in just a generic create React app. You'll notice that the app is going to get started, but we've wrapped that in some global providers. So one big thing you do in building React Enterprise applications is bring together a set of providers, in this particular case, a theme provider, and that theme provider provides global capabilities for the application. So you saw in this application how we consistently themed the individual components. One of the main reasons we could do that is we had a global theme provider. Later on, I'll give you a glimpse of the authentication example we have. The pattern is very similar. The authentication example has an authentication provider. And so we wanted a consistent way to build that. And so all of our examples have this intermediary component that handles some of the global providers in our application. And then we finally go into the app.js, and you can see this is a lot more robust and takes advantage of things like the material UI set of components, which we believe really give you a step forward in getting an enterprise application built. We also have integrated some of the widgets that Lattice brings to bear, and I'm going to show you this example in a bit here, so I just wanted to call that out. And the other thing to notice is that these are all using function components. React, when it first came out, primarily was a class-based component system, but as React has evolved, more function-based components and things like React hooks have become more and more popular. And we've evolved Lattice to make sure that when you choose to build an enterprise application based on one of these templates, you are getting the best practices and the best approach to building the latest version of a React application, which now is already up to version 17. So that's our grid chart and map. I point out only one more just to say that you're going to do a lot of data, heavy data work in an enterprise application typically. And so a lot of times you're going to have to do what is usually called CRUD, create data, read data, update data, and delete data. So CRUD, CRUD. So we have an example called Lattice CRUD that showcases how you might do that. The data retrieval, the data update. I'm not going to go into this one, but I will point out that that's simply one of the examples that are here in the example templates, and it has the same structure of everything else we're talking about. Another huge area that an enterprise React application has to deal with is security and authentication. A typical simple React application may just be available to anybody. You don't need to know who the user is. But when you're building an enterprise application and you're dealing with data, if you're dealing with enterprise data in particular, you want to make sure that data is secure. You probably want to make sure you know who the user is because they're probably in a role, and that role or that group has access to certain things where other groups have access to other things. So you want an infrastructure, you want an environment that handles that. User authentication, the creation of roles, the creation of users. A lot of that is not very specific to your particular application, but is universally needed by enterprise applications. So one of the things that we've done in Lattice is we've taken those capabilities, brought them to a cloud infrastructure, used some tools that are available to allow you to do this stuff in a hosted way. And we've called that the SaaS Starter Kit. So the idea of the SaaS Starter Kit is to allow you to focus in on building your application and not on the mechanics of user authentication, creation of groups, etc. So think of this SaaS Starter Kit as another template that you can use, another starter application that has authentication built in, that allows me to log in, keeps track of users, allows me to optionally add users, or allows me to let users authenticate from sites like Google and Facebook. And then as a general release, the SaaS Starter Kit will allow you to build multiple organizations if that's appropriate for the application you're building. Within an organization, maybe you only have one, you'll still have the need to create users, and these users can be created within this environment. I have the list of users here. I can add a user. I also can, if I back up here, deal with user groups. So I can add users to groups. So the idea of this SaaS Starter Kit is every enterprise application needs this, some form of security. Instead of building it from scratch or doing the research that you need to do, we've brought the best of the ecosystem into a starter application, and you can use this starter application from Lattice to take care of your concerns for that authentication, groups, users, things like that. So that's a high-level look at some of the enterprise examples that are out there. We have probably 6 or 7 more. We have plans for many, many more than that. We're trying to keep things simple so they're learnable, but also applicable to the needs that you'll have in building your enterprise application. So data is always going to be big. Dashboards is going to be huge. And we're going to continue to evolve those as new capabilities and new techniques come to bear within React. I think one of the best examples of that is the fact that recently, as an alternative to the RESTful API approach to building applications, GraphQL has become a very, very popular way to build an infrastructure between your client application and the server data within your database. I'm not going to go into GraphQL. I'd encourage you to take a look at it. But one of the things that you will want to be able to do in your React application is interface with your GraphQL server. And one of the more popular ways to do that is with a library or a set of packages called Apollo. And so there's 2 applications here. There's an Apollo Enterprise, just a generic application that showcases Apollo. And then there's an Apollo real-time charting application that takes that example even further. And if you go up to the React or to the GitHub repository and look into those folders. So here I am at the GitHub repository. Remember, I was looking at a copy of my repo. If I go over to examples and, for example, take a look at the Apollo Enterprise example, the README is a real good place to get an idea of what these examples do. So you can see here that this one's a little bit more of an advanced example. It's starting to have more of a dashboard look and feel. It's got a menu. But the key here is it's doing real database access. If you notice here, there's not only a source folder for the client application, but there's also a server folder. And this server folder is there to be the server side of your application. In this particular case, the server is going to be a GraphQL server hosted in Node, but there are other ways to do it. We just chose Node as one of the best practices way to do it. But In this particular case, you're going to start seeing, how do I use this tool? How do I apply it along with all the other things we're talking about? How do I make sure that not only am I doing data access, but I'm laying things out from a dashboard point of view? How do I still deal with the security needs that I have? How do I also deal with the theming and styling capabilities? So you could think of this enterprise example as building upon some of the more basic ones, but it's just another one of the examples that's here in the list that we have. This is where maybe going over to our lattice.com site and checking out the documentation might make some sense, because you can see here that these boilerplate applications are described, what's appropriate for what you're trying to do. There's also videos, as I mentioned before, that'll talk about which ones to use. And this is a living and breathing site. We are continually updating examples, bringing new things into what we believe are best practices. Our whole goal with this open source environment is to make you productive in the enterprise application space with React through what we've learned in the many, many React applications that we've built. Not only do we think of things in terms of these application templates, so they're whole applications that utilize multiple packages, but we also want to provide best practices in terms of the individual components themselves. So the packages folder talks about some of those best practices components that we feel are right for enterprise applications. And some of them we've talked about already. We've talked about the ability to have grids. And so there's an AG grid example. This is a drag and drop example that we think is important in some subset of enterprise applications. Using editors that may be necessary, gauges, making sure performance is not an afterthought. So the concept of infinite lists, maps you've already seen, recharts, trees. One of the more intriguing ones in this environment, I think, is our generic and everything else, or the widgets package. So I just wanted to give you an example of what I mean by that. All of the Lattice packages are available on the public NPM repository. So you see here I'm in NPM, and I'm here at the @Lattice.js widgets site. As a matter of fact, if I just did @Lattice.js, and spell it right, @Lattice, there we go, JS. You can see here that there are several things that are out there. Here's the gauge, here's a map, here's recharts. But as I said, I'm going to focus on this widgets one. So the idea in this particular one is there are a lot of small Lattice components that either we felt needed to be built to complement an enterprise application, or needed to be in a standalone mode because you use them in various places. And you'll get the idea when you see the types of things that are in here. So this particular version of widgets has, for example, a loader. So the idea of when you're waiting for data in an enterprise application to give some visual feedback in terms of some sort of a loader, a spinner, whatever you might want to call it. And to make that really, really easy to use from an example point of view. A side menu. Almost every enterprise application I see has a menu of some sort, and many of them have that side menu on the left-hand side. So, quickly bringing that up to speed, and just a generic widget. Probably the easiest way to show you this is to show you it up and running. So here's the Lattice widgets example from that packages folder. Again, I've already done a node module install, npm install. And just like all the other examples, I am going ahead and going to do an npm start. You'll notice here that what's coming in to feed this example is the package that I was just looking at in npm, the Lattice.js widgets package. So let's go ahead and do an npm start. And what I've done is I've built this example to be able to showcase the many widgets that are in the example. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the index.js here, well, let me let it run real quick here. This is just going to be one of the examples. Let me come back to that in a minute here. If you'll notice, the index.js here doesn't have all the complexities of the other examples because I built this one from scratch just by looking at the documentation that's here for the Lattice.js widgets library. So you'll notice every one of these examples includes a component with the name of app, and then it does what the component needs to do. So the loader has the name of app. The side menu in our example here has the name app. The widget has the name app. So all I did is I took each of these examples, here's loader, and exported them individually. So here's loader, here's side menu. So they're all exported individual components. And then in index.js, I can just comment and uncomment one of them. So in this particular case, it's going to show loader because I have app from the loader file. So let's go over here and take a look at what that means. There's my loader right there, and it's loaded. So very, very specific, but very, very important pieces to an enterprise application. And just the idea of now we're dealing with remote data. We need to have some way to show things are in process. Very simple. Here's the loader, just one component. Let's take a look at the other ones really quickly. We have a side menu. So I'm going to go ahead and uncomment side menu and comment out loader. I have autosave on in my environment. So now this is going to show off the side menu. So let's go ahead and run it. And there's the side menu. Again, very simple example, shows you the basics of how to build a side menu. The idea here is that you would incorporate this widget into a bigger application. That's why this is in the packages folder of Lattice, not in the examples folder. And then finally, the third one I have here is a widget itself. So if you have just some generic capabilities for a widget or needs for something that's more generic that you can build upon, I'm just rebuilding, restarting, and then here's a basic widget that has a title, that has a little subtext. So building blocks are what really the packages folder represents. And those happen to be custom building blocks. If we took a look at the other examples that are in the Lattice packages folder, you're going to see that many of these are familiar. For example, AG Grid. So you might be asking, well, why is AG Grid in here? Because there already is an AG Grid and it's a commercial application. And can't I just bring that into my React application? You can, but one of the things you'll find out is that it's really not cleanly integrated, for example, with your theming environment. The Lattice.js AG Grid, which if you want to think of it this way, is a wrapper around the native AG Grid, will handle things like theming. So in an enterprise application, you certainly want everything to look consistent. And that's really what we're talking about here. So if you know AG Grid, Lattice AG Grid is just the same component with that consistency from an enterprise application point of view. So there's a lot of examples of things in the Lattice packages folder that has that characteristic, which is I want to use this component. I know it's a popular component in the ecosystem. I don't want to spend the time having to figure out how to integrate it into an enterprise application. Why not just grab it from here? I want to use AG Grid. I want to use the Ferrala editor. I want to use recharts. All of those have that same characteristic. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea of how we're trying to deliver the enterprise experience to you through the Lattice environment. We've got a couple of application examples that I'll quickly show you just to give you an idea of where we've used Lattice and where we've used these enterprise examples with our customers. And one of them here is an example of a little bit of a dashboard, a little bit of a menu, charting capabilities, all built in an application that is a commercial application. So we've taken the concepts, we do this all the time with applications that we're building, and we bring them to bear to the applications that we build. This really jumpstarts our application development because we don't have to have a first phase of the project that worries about what tools are we going to use or what components are we going to use and how do you glue them together. We've already figured all that out and we've already made that available in a very easy to reuse way. I have a few other examples that I don't have running examples of. Anywhere from a very robust shopping experience. In this particular case, it's a customer with a very public-facing shopping experience. So this is where the idea of a consistent user experience really comes into play. So I just wanted to kind of note that to something more consumer-oriented. So a lot of these are more than just informational sites. They're retrieving your data. They're, in the case of this one, retrieving retirement data. You definitely want that to be secure. You don't want someone else being able to access that. So the concept of an enterprise application, again, is data-centric, a lot of times analytical, needs to be secure, and tends to use a lot of robust data components, very typically in a dashboard scenario, if I were to kind of just summarize from that point of view. So in summary, I hope the takeaway you have here is that although it's very simple to create a starter application with Create React App, there are many, many more moving parts to an enterprise React application. And that's really the distinction. You know, what are you trying to build? If you're trying to build a data-centric, security-oriented enterprise application, as you can see, there's many more moving parts. Lattice.js really provides you a best practices starting point. Instead of having to go out there and figure out what you want to build or what tools I should use or how to integrate things together, you really could take one of these starter applications and just get started. That's really the intent. And our intent is to continue to grow and evolve those sets of best practices. I think the best example of that is our recent revision where we completely brought all of our examples, all of our templates, all of our packages up to the new world of React hooks and the latest version of React itself. And so not only will we continue to do that, we'll also look at new components that come to bear, new situations for adding new components to the ecosystem. And so we consider this to be a living and breathing open source environment. And the idea was that this is really our first webinar. We want to go into more detail on various aspects of building an enterprise application. We would love to get your feedback on, you know, what things are you guys struggling with, or what things do you need help with to try to figure out how to build an enterprise application specifically in React. We have ideas, but we want this to be kind of a collaborative effort, and we're more than open either in the chat window right now or after emailing one of us. Give us ideas. What would help you on your journey to build an environment to build React-based enterprise applications? So that's what I have from a presentation point of view. Please feel free to email me with any questions or follow up, or if you want to get more details on some of the examples, I'd be more than happy to help you and guide you along the way. But I'm going to turn it over back to Phil and see if we have any questions from any of this that we can ask, we can answer. I will encourage you, if you do have questions and you haven't yet typed it into the chat window and you'd like to see if we can get to it here, please feel free. Go ahead and type it into the chat window, and we'll try to address it. But Phil, anything from a question point of view?
There's a question related to TypeScript.
Yes.
Does Lattice.js support TypeScript?
Great question. We built the examples initially without TypeScript support, although there are people who feel very strongly that TypeScript should be a major part of anything you build. So that's actually something I wouldn't mind getting some feedback from the community. We do have a couple of examples that we will get out there in Lattice, but we haven't focused on TypeScript only because we feel that in some ways that might take away from the message, although we see how important it is to certain people. So at the moment, we will do things in parallel, both with regular JavaScript and React hooks, and then maybe certain examples with TypeScript. But certainly give us feedback as to where you guys feel that should be.
We have a question here. Does Lattice use the latest features of React, I guess, version 17? Is that?
Yes, as I mentioned, we just went through an iteration where we brought things up. At the time, it was React 16. So in the middle of the versions for React 16 is where some of the new React hooks functionality started coming to play. It was like React 16.3 or 16.4. I don't exactly remember when. So we actually started that journey back in the version 16 days. React 17 is an interesting release. If you do any research on it, it states right in the beginning that React 17, I don't know if it says it exactly this way, but my interpretation is there are no breaking changes in React 17, which is great. Typically, you think a major release are going to have some things that may break your code. But in contrast to most versions, this version focused on performance. There's a whole different engine to interpret JSX, which is what you write when you're creating React components. We fully support that, but frankly, in a lot of those new features, you didn't have to do anything. It just happened. And one of the reasons I run npx create React app, as I did in the beginning, is, as I mentioned, npx gives you the latest version of anything you run, and create React app is running against React version 17. And so pretty much everything I've been doing, I've verified that we're up to speed on version 17, but nothing really new from a programmatic point of view. So the short answer is yes, we definitely do, and we will continue to support the latest and greatest.
In the grid example of the dashboard, is it possible to use this as a MDM, meaning allowing the user to change the data presented and update it back into the DB?
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe I can put it up on the screen.
Yeah, I see that there. Yes, I mean, obviously, and I didn't really go into that React CRUD example. Maybe I should have. But part and parcel of an enterprise application is not only data access, but probably data manipulation. And whether that be in a form or even more appropriately, sometimes in the grid itself. The enterprise application grids that we feel are capable of this are the ones that we bring into the Lattice environment as best practices. So AG grid, for example, the Sencha grid. Those are all robust enterprise data grids and have capabilities to do what I'll call in-row editing of the grid. And they also interface with the back end, because typically a grid is not housing data from memory. It's from a retrieval from the server. So you have to manage all of that. And typically you'll build that. You won't build that capability yourself into the grid. You'll find an enterprise capable grid, and that'd be one of the criteria. I'd say being able to do reliable data manipulation. And what I mean by that is you don't want to make, let's say you bring all your data down to the client, you're editing, and while you're editing, someone else is editing that same record. Well, you obviously want to make sure that something will detect that conflict and give you an ability to resolve it or resolve it on its own. So that's very important. Performance is hugely important. in an enterprise application, it's not unlikely that you'll have thousands or tens of thousands of rows that you'll have to display. And if you just tried to display 10,000 rows in a browser, it would screech to a halt. So there are techniques in these enterprise grids that virtualize the display that are very, very important. But they're not just important to a grid. They're important if you're building something that's not a grid UI that has a lot of data. And that's where there are some virtualized libraries out there. React Virtualize is the name of one, that are very important. And I don't know if you saw, there is a virtualization or an infinite example in Lattice that addresses that as well. So great question, when it comes to data. Data is huge in this context.
Here's a question that came in. How would I use this platform to support time series data? How to put location markers on a map?
Interesting. Well, a lot of the graph, the enterprise graph manufacturers, Recharts for sure is an open source tool. Fusion Charts. Part of their offering is not just graphs, but it's also maps and the ability to overlay onto a map. So I think that's what you're asking about. You certainly could also do that with the Google Map API. You do need a license for that, and Google does charge for that above a certain threshold. But we have some very interesting examples of that and some customer work that we've done. If whoever asked that is interested, we could probably dig some of that up and have a more detailed conversation about that whole idea, overlaying something on a map. Just grab a hold of one of our email addresses and get a hold of us. We can talk about that. Any other questions, Phil?
I think this is related to the previous question.
Okay.
IoT data would most likely be coming from a webhook. How is this process handled?
So I'm not. Go ahead, Phil. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say I'll try to clarify the question but
yeah, I'm not sure what the person asking the question was referring to when they say webhook. If you mean React hook or some sort of other thing, but maybe you can either re-clarify that or get a hold of us. Certainly, access to data and the integration with a component like a grid or charts is vital. And in many of these examples and many things we're doing, we're using React hooks. We're getting data from that environment, like a use effect hook with maybe Axios or GraphQL, and everything works as advertised. If some of that sounds like where you're asking the question, let us know. We can pinpoint some specific examples for you.
Okay. We're here at 1 o'clock. I don't see any other questions.
All right, fantastic. Well, if people do think of questions after we close here, again, maybe a few more seconds, jot down my email address, or if you email any one of us, we can get it to the right people. But we're very much looking to feedback and what you guys are looking for, what you're doing, what you're building in enterprise applications, and we definitely look forward to hearing from you.
Great, thank you, Mark.
All right,
thank you all for attending.
Thank you, everyone.